And is Brexit in peril?
I hope not. You know, we had a democratic decision. If a British Prime Minister were to try and move us too closely back to the EU, that would ring a lot of alarm bells in the White House. Starmer remains a Remainer at heart.
Yeah.
If he could take us back in tomorrow, he would.
Yeah.
But I think the British people would go nuts if he tried to do that. President Trump historically has always had reservations about the EU.
Hello, welcome to Harry Cole Saves the West, the show where American grit meets British backbone. Joining me tonight, all the way from London, the Shadow Armed Forces Minister, the former Armed Forces Minister, Conservative MP, Mark Francois, once I say hero of the Brexit revolution, I think is your official title, is it? Or Brexit Spartan #1?
Well, that's very kind of Harry. I'll take that. Thank you very much.
Very good. Welcome to Washington, D.C., Mark. We're going to get into why you're here in a moment, but I want to talk about something that's happening back in London, and an issue dear to your heart, issue dear to my heart. Brexit in peril. I'm not quite putting up the Batman sign into the sky yet, but there's a lot of mood music coming out of Number 10. There's a lot of mood music coming out of the Labour Party. They're starting to see it in the commentators. The old Remainers, they're circling the wagons. They're getting ready to ride again. Is Brexit in peril?
I hope not. You know, we had a democratic decision. We spent months arguing
Years.
out. You know, the British people, voted for it, and then eventually we left. And I think it'd be completely the wrong thing to try and put the whole country through that again. Whether you were pro or anti-Brexit, it was a difficult process to actually leave because so many people in Parliament refused to accept the democratic decision of the people.
The judiciary, large parts of the media.
No, we're out now. We've left, and we need to make our way in the world and be responsible for our own decisions. Interestingly, being here in Washington this week, having spoken to quite a few people, the point's been made to us that President Trump historically has always had reservations about the EU. He sees it as highly bureaucratic, over-regulatory, and he's right. And if a British Prime Minister were to try and move us too closely back to the EU, that would ring a lot of alarm bells in the White House.
Well, absolutely, and you don't have to, you don't have to scratch very far to find those concerns publicly voiced by this administration. And I suspect we might hear something from the President himself, were he to be asked about it in the coming days. We're all looking for an opportunity to do that. But, it's not just Americans, is it? We've signed up to the, I'm going to try and get it right, the CPTP tradie thingy, the Trans-Pacific
Partnership.
Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's a massive, that's 11 countries, I believe, access to 11 different markets, and it's, that would go out the window. If we rejoin the EU Customs Union, which seems to be floated by Keir Starmer's economic advisor in the run-up to the budget, we had, people, Labour MPs have been talking about it. If we rejoined the Customs Union, correct me if I'm wrong, the trade deals we've done with Japan, Australia, New Zealand, they'd be kaput, right?
Right. The clue's in the name. If you're in a customs union, you cannot do independent bilateral trade deals.
Which was half the point of leaving.
Correct. You can only do them via the EU. So the fact that we've been able to do trade deals with the United States and with Japan and India,
a little one.
Well, I think we'd all like to see a big, beautiful deal.
Yes.
And I believe that is still possible, but not if you re-enter a customs union. You can then only do it in the EU. So that was one of the reasons for leaving, so that we could make our own economic destiny. And I'm pretty sure if they tried to re-enter the customs union, Trump would be on the phone pretty quick.
And also politically, I mean, let's look at the two political blocks. And my gut instinct is that you essentially hand the keys to Number 10 to Nigel Farage if Labour tried to unpick Brexit. It would be catnip for him, right?
Yes, and for the Conservative Party too. We've now finally.
Would you not have a duty to come back together like you did in 2019 with the Brexit Party in that situation to say, Brexit in peril, we need to do a deal here?
On the kind of Tory reform thing, Harry, my view, I know Nigel reasonably well. When I remarried 3 years ago, he was a personal guest at my wedding.
Oh,
so we
congratulations.
Well, thank you. We go back a ways. And he still is very angry, rightfully, that in 2019, when he stood down his Brexit candidates, he'd seen 3 years of trench warfare in Parliament. And he realised the only way we'd leave was if Boris won and won well. So he stands down his candidates and incumbents.
And there's all sorts of suggestions that there was a peerage dangled and various things like that.
Let me come on to it. So you could argue that he put country before party.
Well, he certainly does.
Well, yeah, OK. And in return, there was all this stuff about should we have given him a peerage or should we give him a We never even gave him lunch. And he likes lunch. Well, as we know,
he really likes
even
lunch.
long ones. But the point is, Boris didn't say thank you.
Yeah.
And that still rankles in his breast, as it were. And so at the moment, there's bad blood.
Yeah.
So, what might happen in a few years' time, who knows? But at the moment, Reform's view is we did the right thing, you didn't acknowledge it, so... we're gonna take you on. If Labour, I mean, when you're in the States, there's a sort of convention. You don't sort of foul-mouth the old country. But
you're making it quite hard from where I'm sitting here. All right, looking back,
all right, look. Okay. I've always, having seen him in action night after night, week after week, right. I even read a book about it called Spartan Victory, still available on Amazon.
Very good it is too. I have a signed copy.
Bless you, sir. Thank you very much. As endorsed by Harry Cole, the Sun's editor at large. But look, Starmer remains a Remainer at heart.
Yeah.
If he could take us back in tomorrow, he would.
Yeah.
But I think the British people would go nuts if he tried to do that.
Oh, I mean...
And I think the American president would go nuts if he tried to do that. So I hope he won't try to do that. But he's sort of doing it via grandmother's footsteps.
Well, that's the thing. But also, if you look at it, taking off your Tory hat and looking at it as a seasoned politician, and you know how these things work. If you look at where Labour are now, they are fractured. They're bleeding out to the Greens. They're bleeding out to the Gaza independents, as we euphemistically have to call them now.
They don't know what to call themselves.
And then the Liberal Democrats also have got the a big old chunk of support. The only way that Keir Starmer survives in power is if he somehow unites the left. Isn't this the issue to go for? Just go hell for leather. Make it a left versus right, Brexit versus Remain issue.
Well, look, OK, there are lots of potential scenarios, but to follow your argument, let's assume that Corbyn somehow gets his act together. Just for the purposes of debate. Let's assume that for a moment he does.
Yeah.
By next spring, you could have 6 parties on the left in British politics. Labour, the Liberal Democrats, I put them on the left.
Yeah.
Right, OK. Your party, or whatever they're going to call it. The Greens, the SNP in Scotland, and Plaid Cymru in Wales, right? So you've got 6 parties on the left, and you'd have 2 parties on the right, the Conservative Party and the Reform Party. So it's 6 plays 2. Now, 3 years on from now in a general election, who knows what those relative poll weights might be? So who knows what the outcome of that might be? But just at the moment, for the reasons I've given you, honestly, Reform are still very angry with us, and I don't think that anger is... So this is a question, realistically, for a couple of years' time rather than next week, if you follow my argument.
I've got you. We'll come back and we'll discuss it as it goes on. You're here in DC. Who are you with? How come you're here? Who have you seen?
I'm here with a London-based think tank called the Coalition for Global Prosperity.
Excellent. Sound like they're as good ideas?
Well, they specialise in security and trade and to some degree aid and international development, but their argument would be that you should spend that money in line with our security priorities and to combat Chinese influence and all of that.
Yeah.
And it makes a lot of sense to me. So, and we've had a lot of meetings on the Hill, and we've been at the British Embassy this morning. And the good news is London's view still matters in this town.
I think it matters more. I think it matters more under this administration, far, far more than. Frankly, you realise quite how much Joe Biden hated Britain, and Obama before him in a weird way. Obama had his different reasons, which was he was kind of, there was a sort of colonial sort of empire issue there. Joe Biden was straight up, Irish. We know whose side he was on.
Yeah.
Whereas this administration, and that feeds into the Hill, is we're back.
Well, I think Trump's an Anglophile. There's the whole thing about his mother.
Yeah.
I think he has an affection for Britain, for the royal family. But beyond that, there's all this talk about the special relationship, right? Books have been written about it. But there are fundamental ties. The wiring is deep. at the military level, that's been reinforced this week, and the intelligence level, the Five Eyes.
Yeah, from space to the cables underneath the sea.
Correct.
To things you can't even see.
Correct.
To
you know,
Diego Garcia,
yeah,
to Chagos, to
right.
all of this.
Well, Chagos is a separate issue, but you know, so the wiring runs hard and deep, and it seems to us, from what we can tell this week, the wiring is still, you know, very live.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you've got a president who is a natural anglophile. So I think it's true that with this president compared to his two predecessors, you know, what the British Prime Minister says,
Yeah.
you know, even if he's a Labour Prime Minister, resonates.
Does that resonate when it comes to Ukraine? Because at the moment, we, as a Britain has been at the forefront of this from arguably from since David Cameron's day. David Cameron was the first person to start arming the Ukrainians. It may have been with sticks and hats rather than. But he trained them. He trained them in 2014 after Crimea, and then obviously Britain's role has increased ever since then. We are at the forefront of this thing. It feels like we're a little bit on the sidelines at the moment. You've got Jared Kushner, you know, not a diplomat, a businessman. You've got Steve Witkoff, a real property developer, you know, in the room with Putin. It's basically the Europeans are, you know, sort of trying to make as much noise on the sidelines while Trump's saying you guys have got to pick up the tab for this. It does feel like we've been slightly squeezed out of this chat now.
Well, I think the Europeans were, after the so-called 28-point plan, which I think was very worrying.
Yeah.
You know, the Europeans got involved very quickly. People flew out here. They spoke to the president. I think they managed to explain why that was a really bad idea. Rubio, who I've got a lot of time for, got involved. He goes to Geneva. He talks to the Ukrainians. So suddenly the 28 points are 19 points. And now,
yeah, but frankly, it doesn't really matter how many points there are. The fundamentals are the Donbass, which looks like it's on the chop. Security guarantees, be that NATO for Article 5 or something that looks and sounds a lot like Article 5, and this ridiculous notion that the Ukrainians have to cap their military at 500,000 or whatever it was.
Let's take them in turn.
Yeah.
On security guarantees, there was something called the Budapest Agreements in 2004, when the Ukrainians were given security guarantees.
Yeah, I mean, they were worth the. They weren't worth the.
So if you're a Ukrainian, you're a bit sceptical about that. That's
course.
point one.
Yeah.
On the Donbass, you're dead right. You've got the so-called fortress belt of towns. You know, where the Ukrainians have expended a great deal of blood and treasure. The reason that's so important, Harry, is, you know, that is strategic commanding ground. If they gave that up, and I don't believe they will under any circumstances.
They'd be in Kyiv by tea time.
Well,
the Russians could be in Kyiv
there's
by tea time.
open ground behind it all the way to the Dnieper River.
Yeah.
You know, that's why they've fought so hard to keep it. So militarily...
And that's why they've been able to keep it as well.
It's a bit analogous to Israel giving up the Golan Heights. You know, you can't do that militarily.
Yeah.
So I don't think Zelensky, even under great pressure, would do that. Now, here's the other thing for your American audience, if I may. Vladimir Putin is a former regular colonel in the KGB. This is a man who's personally sanctioned the use of highly accurate cruise missiles to blow up children's hospitals. And, this bloke is not a Boy Scout.
And chemical weapons on the streets of
Salisbury.
Yeah.
So we've got to be very clear-eyed about what we're dealing with. And I think people like Marco Rubio really understand that. And at some point, I hope, it's not for me to tell the President of the United States what to do.
Go on, he's watching. Go on. What would you say to him if you were?
Well, if you were, I'd say, Mr. President, thank you for coming to Britain. But I would say there's only so many last chances you can give Vladimir Putin.
I mean, it does really feel like we're in the last chance saloon now, doesn't it? Like, it's, you know, Alaska back to square one. You know, I think Trump slightly overcooked it in Alaska, got the wrong end of the stick. Still, Putin, no. Then we had the remarkable summit here with Zelensky and the European leaders, which was, you know, sort of would have wound the Russians up. It was always sort of overcorrected for what went wrong in Alaska. Then we finally got these sanctions, oil sanctions, a few weeks ago. If they can keep the price of oil low, you know, if the Gulf states start to play ball, increase production, that is going to really hurt the Russians. But then it seems like, I don't know, it just sort of feels like it's careering all over the place. Just when you start to squeeze them into bollocks, suddenly you're sending Steve Witkoff round for a cup of tea. Like, what's going on?
Look, the sale of oil and gas, of hydrocarbons, that's Putin's windpipe.
Yeah.
And the latest round of sanctions were far tougher, and it really hurt Lukoil and Rosneft.
Yeah, no. Yeah.
So you know, what the Russians have done is they have consistently just restated their demands again and again and again and again. And Lavrov, the foreign minister, who I've met, if we've got time, I'll tell you a funny story about that. He's a great sort of dead bat merchant, as we would say in cricket, right? So they just, one way or another, whether it's Alaska or anywhere else, just keep reiterating their demands in the hope that in the end, Trump will get so bored he'll just try and give them what he wants.
Are they just going to try and sit Trump out? They've only got to wait, another 3 years. I mean, realistically, they've only got to wait another year.
Putin thinks he's winning. He's completely impervious.
Let's not beat around the bush, though. He kind of is winning.
Well, one village at a time, yeah. So, and he's completely oblivious to the scale of Russian casualties. He's like Stalin in that respect.
Yeah.
So he's not mad, he's utterly ruthless, and his aim, you've only got to read his speeches, is to recreate something that looks like the old Soviet Union. And that means Georgia, that means the Baltic states. So bluntly, the Ukrainians are fighting for what are classic American values. They're fighting for freedom, they're fighting for democracy. And if we don't stop Putin in Ukraine, we'll have to stop him in the Baltics. And if we don't stop him in the Baltics, we'll have to stop him in Poland, Harry. And by that stage, you're in the middle of something that looks like World War III. So better to stop him where he is.
I mean, what a perfect point to leave it. Tell us your Lavrov story.
Right, so very quickly.
We've got time.
Right, so when I worked for William Hague, when he was the Shadow Foreign Secretary, so we're in opposition under Cameron, right? And I was the Shadow Europe Minister, and we went to a meeting at the Russian Embassy in Knightsbridge with Lavrov. And we'd been briefed...
Stinks of fags and booze.
Well, we'd been briefed... Here you go. We'd been briefed he was a chain smoker. But the meeting was at 11 o'clock in the morning, right? Oof. So we go in there and we do the preliminaries, and then he lights up after 5 minutes. And he says to William, I can do this because this is the Russian sovereign territory. You passed this stupid law that you cannot smoke in public. But here your stupid law does not... He says to William, did you vote for the stupid law? So William says, well, Mr. Lavrov, as a matter of fact, I didn't. I voted against it on grounds of individual liberty. He says, very good. He says, you worked for him. Yes, sir. Did you vote for the stupid law? I said, no, I voted against it for the same reasons as my boss. You followed your way. You will go far in politics. He says, so you both vote against the stupid law? And we said, yes. He said, I like you. Vodka.
Jeez, 11 in the morning.
Yeah. So they bring in this sort of bottle of, 50-year-old Russian vodka. So, imagine sort of 50-year-old Macallan, right? Yeah. It's the equivalent of that. And I look at William as if to say, what do we do? And he looks at me as if to say, well, for Queen and country. So we're knocking back these shots of vodka. By now it's 11:30. For the record, I had 2, Harry. And to this day, I still...
As long as you didn't drive home.
No. To this day, I still wonder what they'd actually put in it.
But just the tea you got to worry about.
So I had... But Lavrov, here's the important point, has survived in Putin's orbit for 20 years.
I know. The amount of times you read stories of him being sort of sent, metaphorically sent to Siberia, but he's a great survivor.
He hasn't fallen out of a 5th floor window yet.
Oh yeah, we'd avoid windows after telling that story. So you're not yet, Sir Mark Francois. Mark Francois, it should be Sir Mark Francois. Mark Francois, thank you for joining us.
Great, thanks.
Lovely to see you as ever.
Good to see you. Thanks very much.